What do we need to do briefly before we have what I hope will be a lot of questions and discussion about this? First of all, I think we need to recognize that 99% probably of the investment that is ultimately going to be made in the energy sector is going to come from private investors. We need to recognize that. And so government needs to create an environment in which willingly, because they can't be forced, willingly investors have the confidence to make those investments. And I think that requires public policy to respect the need to reduce the risk around these investments. You know, if you look, and I'm sure it's come out throughout the day, if you look at the degree of risk that's inherent in some of the investments in the new energy economy, you know, there's the what's going to happen to fuel prices in the future. There's the project risk in building anything, especially projects out at sea. You've got the future state of the economy to be fretted over. You've got the state of the financial markets, much more difficult to read than they were in the past. So plenty of risk out there for investors to have to take on board. And I think at the very least, public policy, in its clarity and stability, ought to be a haven from that risk, and certainly ought not to amplify it further than it is. But I think, and I'd be interested in the views of people in this room, however unwittingly, over the last 10 or 12 years, the unpredictability of policy has actually added probably a risk premium to the cost of capital for these investments. And it's very important, I think, that we eradicate that. I think it's very important that policy is clearly promulgated by government, by ministers. We've had too much, and I'm sure Ed would agree with this. If you look back at the number of ministers we've had, I think we've had 11 energy ministers and 8 secretaries of state. I think Ed is the 8th secretary of state responsible for energy, and 11 junior ministers under them with that responsibility. It's quite a technical subject, as Adam was saying coming in. There's been quite a degree of technical discussion this morning. The idea that you've got an average tenure of a year or so, people can get a grip with the subject and formulate a policy that can endure, is not going to happen. I think you do need to have serious stability there. You need a better planning system. We've had some reforms that have been made, very important for long-term investments like nuclear. I think we'd go a bit further still and want to make them proof against the possibility of judicial review. Some of the planning policy statements that are now being presented to Parliament are not going to be ratified by Parliament, and I think that means that there's an uncertainty as to whether they might be overturned by the courts. So very important that we have stability and clarity in that. Very important role for public policy in providing networks, whether it's offshore. We know that quite apart from the risk in financing projects, one of the questions in investors' minds is whether you're going to get the grid connections to be able to bring onshore the electricity that's generated offshore. We think that the government ought to take a proactive lead in that and require the national grid to be extended offshore so that those connections are there, ready and waiting, so that investors can have the confidence that they can plug into them without needing to build that risk of delayed or non-existent connections into their business case. When it comes to carbon capture and storage, great that we're going to demonstrate CCS, but while we're doing it, why don't we build the pipeline network oversized, so it's not just for the demonstration purposes of the particular plant that is the winner of the competition, but if, as we hope and must assume that there's a prospect that it's going to work, then other industry, and Teesside is a classic example of this, other industry that emits CO2 can then plug into that pre-existing network and make sure that their CO2 can be sequestrated perhaps in the North Sea. Recharging points for electric vehicles. Electric vehicles have a great potential, but no one's going to buy them if they can't rely on being able to plug them in. And there's an important role, I think, for government there to make sure that we have, in our cities and around the country, enough charging points for people to have that confidence. So very important that we do that. I could go on, and perhaps in questions we might talk more about this. Energy efficiency was mentioned. Energy efficiency is often the Cinderella subject when it comes to energy. Some people sort of regard lagging your loft and putting cavity wall insulation as perhaps rather less exciting than some of the cutting-edge technologies that have been described during the day. But it's incredibly important, not just in terms of our CO2 emissions, the potential for reductions there, but actually to save money on our fuel bills, whether it's as individuals, domestically, or whether it's as businesses, to help us be more competitive. So it's very important that we have policies there that have a step change in the energy efficiency of our homes and, in due course, commercial buildings. Let me end by just answering a question that's always raised, or has been raised during recent months, which is, this is all very well, this investment that I think people recognize can be made and is quite exciting, but can you do it in a recession? Is this the time when actually you can commit the degree of ambition that is needed for this? And actually, I think the answer has to be, not only can you, but actually the recession makes it even more important that you do so. When people's margins are stretched, when household bills are the burden that they are, when people are worried about their household finances, then using energy more efficiently makes sense even more so during these difficult times than during times of plenty. We need to be ready for the recovery. We need to prepare for the resumption of vigorous international competition, because you can be sure that our competitors will. And if we find that fossil fuel prices escalate very rapidly, and we are very reliant on those old forms of energy, whereas other countries have diversified their portfolio, then we are going to be exposed in competitive terms when we are competing for business overseas. So it's imperative, I think, that we get on with that. And as I say, I think others are doing that, will be doing that. And so, if I guess sort of taking a breather, taking a nap was a bad strategy for the hare, for the countries that were ahead of this. It's even worse for the tortoise if we regard ourselves as having sort of lagged behind there. So we do need to catch up. We need to get on with this. We have, I think, a closing window in which to make these investments that are necessary not just for our own energy security and economy, but in order to allow us to reap this great potential that there is in this region and around the world. I think this is something that crosses party politics. I didn't hear Ed's remarks, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was pointing in the same general direction of this. I think we need to get on with it. I think there is an imperative for us all to recognize that this isn't something that we should seek to find party political advantage in, but to give a stable framework in which investment can be made. And if we do that, I think it would be thrilling, whoever wins the election, who is ever in government, to come back to this conference in 10 years' time and be able to reflect on what I hope will then be a fact, that once again this region is associated around the world for being at the cutting edge of the technologies and the industry that are in greatest demand around the world. Thank you very much indeed for listening.